The lights were low. The band had just finished its playful riff, and the crowd buzzed with anticipation. On this night, the stage of late-night television was set for laughter and nostalgia. But what unfolded was not comedy. It was a clash, one that peeled back the polished smiles of Hollywood and revealed something raw, something uncomfortable. When Sylvester Stallone stepped onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage, the audience expected jokes and stories. Instead, they witnessed a battle for dignity, a duel fought not with fists, but with words sharper than any blade. And as the tension rose, it became clear this was not going to be another routine late-night interview. It was going to be a confrontation that would echo far beyond the studio walls. Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward, grinning wide, as he introduced the guest of the night, the man who turned mumbling into an art form, Rocky himself, Sylvester Stallone. The audience erupted in applause as Stallone walked out, his presence commanding, his blazer sharp against the deep maroon of his shirt. He sat down, smiling politely, but the air already carried an edge. Jimmy cracked his first joke, lightly mocking Stallone's age, his voice, and even hinting at the fading relevance of his career. The crowd chuckled, though some laughed more out of habit than humor. Stallone chuckled too, but his eyes narrowed slightly, as though measuring the weight behind the words. On the surface, it was light banter, but under the surface, something heavier stirred, a sense that the night might turn from playful to personal. Jimmy leaned in again. "So tell me, another action flick? Or did you finally decide to make something with plot?" The crowd laughed, but Stallone did not. His voice was calm, almost gravelly as he replied, "It's a story about redemption, a veteran facing his past. It speaks to pain, real pain." Jimmy tilted his head, feigning awe. "Deep," he said mockingly. "And here I thought it was just another excuse to flex your biceps." A few chuckles echoed in the room, but the air had grown colder. Stallone looked at him steadily. "Sometimes pain needs muscle," he said. "Not to show off, but to carry the weight." His words hung in the air, stripping the humor from the moment. What had begun as playful teasing was shifting. The jokes weren't landing, and the man in the chair was not laughing. Jimmy smirked, ready with another jab. "So, the first Rocky, they say you wrote it in 3 days. Did you just run out of crayons?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, but this time it was uneasy. Stallone paused, his eyes steady. Then he spoke. "I wrote it with everything I had, while sleeping in a bus terminal, while trying to sell my dog just to eat. So no, crayons weren't really the priority." Silence fell. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a heavy stillness. Even Jimmy looked caught off guard. Stallone leaned closer, his voice steady, his words cutting deeper than any punch. "Sometimes you crack jokes, Jimmy. Sometimes you crack dignity. Be careful which you're breaking tonight." The room was hushed, the tension unmistakable. In that instant, the story had shifted. This was no longer an interview. It was a test of respect. Jimmy tried to recover, smiling thinly. "Don't want to get body slammed on live TV," he joked. Stallone replied smoothly, "Don't worry. I only hit when it's scripted." The audience chuckled nervously, but the sparring was sharpening. Jimmy pressed on, mocking the endless sequels and repeating characters. "You keep playing the same guy, just with a new haircut." Stallone crossed his legs, his expression unreadable. Better than being a new haircut with the same jokes. The crowd erupted. Laughter turned into applause, and suddenly, the balance of power shifted. Jimmy forced a smile, but his grip was slipping. The banter was no longer friendly. The words were weapons now, and Stallone had just landed a direct hit. Jimmy, still trying to regain control, leaned forward. "But seriously, aren't you worried people see you as just a punchline?" Stallone's gaze hardened. "Only when hosts like you write the jokes," he said. The crowd reacted instantly, a ripple of cheers breaking through. Then he continued, his voice firm. "Rocky wasn't just a film. It was hope. For people who had nothing. For people who needed to believe in themselves again." The applause grew louder, echoing through the studio. Jimmy sat back, momentarily silenced. The laughter he had counted on was gone, replaced by something else. Respect, pouring out from the audience toward the man in the chair. Jimmy tried a different angle. "But you're a millionaire now, right? Doesn't it seem a little rich to keep talking about struggle?" The words drew a few uneasy laughs, but Stallone's reply cut through the air. "Struggle doesn't disappear with a paycheck. It leaves scars. It teaches you to recognize when you're being used for someone else's punchline. The audience grew silent, sensing the weight of the exchange. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably, for the first time rattled. He tried to laugh it off, but his smile was brittle. Stallone leaned back, calm, unflinching. The divide between them was clear now, one man grasping for laughs, the other speaking truths too heavy to ignore. Jimmy regrouped, pressing again. Isn't your career just nostalgia now? Without the past, what's left in the present? Stallone didn't blink. His voice was colder, measured. Critics talk. Legends build. I don't need to relive the past. I built it. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then the audience burst into thunderous applause, louder than at any point before. The energy had shifted completely. Jimmy was no longer the master of ceremonies. He was a man struggling to keep control of a stage that was no longer his. Stallone, calm and unwavering, had turned the weight of his legacy into a shield. What had started as jokes about fading fame had become proof of something undeniable, respect earned through battles fought, both on screen and in life. The commercial break ended. The lights snapped back on. Jimmy straightened his jacket, trying to look as if nothing had happened in the first half of the show. The band played a quick riff. The audience clapped politely, but the room wasn't the same anymore. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that had been simmering just beneath the surface. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, the moment when everyone senses that something is about to break. Jimmy forced his grin and spoke louder than usual, as if trying to re-establish control. We're back with the one and only Sylvester Stallone. The man, the myth, what is it now? An 80s action figure. The audience chuckled, but the laughter was thin, hesitant. They weren't sure whether they were supposed to laugh anymore. All eyes turned to Stallone that he leaned forward slightly, his expression calm, his tone steady. Better to be molded in stone, he said evenly, than made of plastic, Jimmy. The line landed with precision. The audience roared. Applause erupted, filling the studio, breaking through the awkwardness. Jimmy's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with another laugh. Well, I guess your fans are loyal, he said, his voice tightening. Almost aggressively so, like they think you're still that scrappy underdog from Philly. Stallone's reply was short, almost quiet, but it cut through the room. I am. I just wear better shoes now. The crowd erupted again, laughter mixed with applause, but this time the laughter was with Stallone, not at him. The tide had turned completely, and Jimmy knew it. Trying to regain control, Jimmy leaned in. But come on, Sly? Haven't we moved past the underdog thing? Isn't it time to hang up the gloves? Literally and metaphorically. His smirk was forced now, almost brittle. The audience wasn't laughing as freely. They were waiting to see what Stallone would do next. That Stallone's gaze locked on him. His words were deliberate, heavy with meaning. You ever tell a soldier to hang up his boots because the war makes you uncomfortable? The room froze. The question wasn't rhetorical, it was a direct challenge. The audience gasped, some clapping instinctively. Jimmy blinked, caught off guard. I don't think making Rocky IX qualifies as war, he replied, his voice carrying a nervous edge. But Stallone didn't flinch. It does, he said firmly. When you're fighting cynicism, when you're fighting apathy, when you're fighting the belief that people like me can't still inspire. That's a war, and some of us are still in it. Applause exploded through the studio, stronger than ever. The audience was on Stallone's side completely now, and Jimmy could feel it. The cracks in his armor were showing. He chuckled awkwardly, but his shoulders were stiff. So what you're saying is it's not ego, Jimmy said. It's mission. Stallone didn't hesitate. No, it's responsibility. Responsibility to remind people that you don't stop because the world tells you to. You stop when you decide you're done. His voice deepened, his tone final, and the audience cheered so loudly the band members exchanged glances. It wasn't laughter anymore. It was respect. Jimmy tried to play it off, nodding as though he had guided the conversation there himself. Powerful words, he said, his smile thin. Then he jabbed again, desperate. Spoken like a man trying to sell a box office ticket. Stallone's eyes hardened. He leaned forward, closer to Jimmy, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut. You know, Jimmy, you keep trying to turn this into a punchline. Maybe because deep down, you're afraid someone might take me seriously. The audience erupted once more, louder than ever. Cheers, claps, even shouts echoed across the room. Jimmy sat back, visibly rattled. His smirk faltered, his jaw tightened, and for the first time all night, the host looked small in his own chair. But Jimmy wasn't ready to surrender. He forced a laugh and leaned forward again, his voice raised. "You want to know what scares me, Sly? It's that people think your on-screen persona is who you really are. That Rocky is real." Stallone paused, his gaze steady, unblinking. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but every word carried to the back of the room. "Rocky is real, not just because I wrote him, but because millions of people saw themselves in him. He's a mirror, Jimmy, something you clearly avoid looking into." The room exploded again, but this time the applause wasn't just support. It was defiance. It was the sound of an audience rejecting the host's authority and siding with the man who had earned their respect through decades of battles, both fictional and real. The tension was electric, sharp enough to slice through the air. Jimmy sat frozen for a beat, blinking, his smile gone. He tried to recover, forcing out a nervous laugh. "Come on, Sly. Can't you take a joke?" Stallone leaned back, his expression unreadable, his voice steady as stone. "Can you take the truth?" The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Not awkward, crushing. The entire studio was still. Even the band had gone silent. Every camera captured the moment. Every viewer at home could feel the weight of it. For the first time, Jimmy looked cornered. His jokes had turned to dust in his hands, his authority stripped away by a man who refused to be made a punchline. And then, with deliberate calm, Stallone shifted in his chair. Slowly, he stood. The audience gasped. People sat forward in their seats, unsure of what they were about to witness. Jimmy raised his eyebrows, trying to make light of it. "Whoa, hey, Sly. What's going on?" he said, his tone half nervous, half mocking. Stallone adjusted his blazer, his movements slow, deliberate, measured. "I've taken enough," he said quietly. His voice was low, but it carried across the room like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted in applause, standing in solidarity, their cheers rolling across the studio like a wave. Jimmy's smile collapsed into a tight grimace. He tried to laugh, raising his hands. "Hey, don't walk out on me. We're just having fun here." But Stallone didn't look back at him. He looked out at the audience instead, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the loudest cheers. "I've given enough to this industry, to this audience, to the spirit of storytelling. Enough." The words hit harder than any punch could. The audience rose to their feet. The stage, once Jimmy's arena, now belonged entirely to the man walking away from it. And in that moment, the battle was over. Stallone hadn't stormed off in anger. He hadn't shouted or raged. He had done something far more powerful. He had taken back his dignity and left Jimmy Kimmel standing in the ruins of his own stage. The breaking point had arrived, and it had changed everything. The studio was still buzzing as Stallone stood tall, his presence commanding the entire room. The cameras captured every angle. The veteran actor, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes focused not on Jimmy but on the audience. He wasn't rushing. Every move felt deliberate, controlled, almost cinematic. Jimmy shifted in his chair, nervous laughter slipping out. "Come on, Sly. We're just having a little fun here." His words stumbled over themselves, betraying the tension in his voice. The once confident host now looked like a man scrambling to regain footing on a crumbling stage. But Stallone didn't dignify him with an answer. Instead, he adjusted his blazer with a slow, precise tug, then leaned forward just enough so his voice carried without the help of microphones. "Fun is supposed to lift people up," he said, his tone calm but sharp, "not grind them down." The audience erupted into cheers, and for the first time, the clapping wasn't polite or hesitant. It was fierce, defiant, directed against Jimmy. People stood up in their seats, applauding the man who had just turned the tables on a host who made a career of laughing at others. Jimmy's grin faltered again, and he tried one last desperate jab. "Hey, Sly, don't take it so seriously. You're gonna make me look like the bad guy here." Stallone finally turned his head, his expression steady and unflinching. "You don't need my help for that." The words landed like a knockout blow. The audience roared, their cheers shaking the rafters, drowning out Jimmy's weak chuckle. And then Stallone began to walk. Not storming, not stomping, walking with dignity. His pace was steady, measured, as though every step was a declaration. He didn't need this stage, this host, or this validation. He had earned his place in history long before tonight. As he reached the edge of the stage, he turned back once more. His eyes swept across the audience, not at Jimmy, not at the cameras, but at the people who had risen to their feet for him. "I've fought enough battles," he said, voice resonant and calm. "But respect, that's the one fight worth never giving up." The audience thundered with applause, some shouting his name, others chanting Rocky, Rocky, Rocky. The sound filled the studio like a tidal wave, drowning out everything else. Jimmy sat frozen at his desk, his cue cards limp in his hand, his smirk gone. Stallone lifted a hand in a quiet wave, then walked off stage, leaving behind a host scrambling to salvage his show. The cameras caught every second, the hero's exit, the crowd's eruption, the host's silence. In that moment, the walkout wasn't an escape. It was a victory. The clip went viral before Stallone even left the studio. Audience members had their phones out, uploading the walkout to social media in real time. Within minutes, hashtags like Respect Stallone and Kimmel Humiliated were trending worldwide. Fans flooded Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok with praise for Stallone, replaying his sharpest lines, editing them into motivational montages, and comparing the showdown to one of his iconic movie moments. Memes appeared instantly. Jimmy sitting alone at his desk with captions like "defeated in round one," or Stallone leaving with the words "still a champ." Celebrities chimed in, from actors who admired Stallone's resilience to athletes who saw his walkout as the perfect metaphor for dignity in the face of disrespect. Even some comedians, usually loyal to their late-night peers, quietly sided with Stallone, admitting that comedy without respect is just cruelty. Backstage, the mood was entirely different from the tension on stage. Crew members and junior staffers who had witnessed the exchange firsthand offered quiet nods, some even patting Stallone on the shoulder as he walked past. A few whispered, "That was legendary." For them, it wasn't just a guest leaving a show. It was a man reclaiming his identity. Meanwhile, Jimmy tried to push on with the broadcast, but the damage was done. His jokes fell flat, the audience still buzzing from what they had just witnessed. Commentators the next day didn't frame it as a tense interview. They framed it as a collapse, a moment where a host accustomed to control was stripped of power on his own stage. Articles popped up across the internet. Stallone shuts down late-night mockery. Jimmy Kimmel outclassed by action legend. And when Rocky became real again, Stallone's quotes were reprinted everywhere, especially the line, "Can you take the truth?" It resonated with people far beyond Hollywood. Fans saw more than a spat between two entertainers. They saw a cultural shift, proof that the old model of mocking celebrities until they break was no longer acceptable. Stallone hadn't just defended himself. He had defended every artist who ever felt belittled, every person who ever walked into a room and was underestimated by the week's end. Stallone's dignity was intact, his reputation stronger than ever. Jimmy, however, was left with an uncomfortable question lingering over his career. When the laughter fades, what's left? The walkout became a story not just about a man protecting his legacy, but about how resilience, respect, and authenticity always outlast cheap jokes. And for millions watching, it was clear, Sylvester Stallone was never the punchline. He was, and still is, the fighter who refuses to stay down.